we have a meeting scheduled for December 14th, and that will be a closed session meeting as we indicated to the public previously. We also have an upcoming meeting on January 11th. This particular board meeting is dedicated to the appeal process, appeal for PCR 2021-0018. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Benjamin Stanley to this process. And at this time, we'll have the liaison, which would be Ms. Shelley, present a summary of the appeal.
Good evening. Thank you, Chair Payne, members, Mr. Stanley, and Chief's Office. I will read these in order of the allegations. Allegation 1, during this incident, PSO Ellis, PSO Lockett, and Sergeant Bentley advised you that they are not familiar with the service dog law, as it is not law we commonly deal with. You then provided all officers with the law on your cell phone and they reviewed it. You expressed to the officers that you did not want the pastor to get in trouble, but to just educate him on the law. Officers speak with the pastor, educating him on the law, but he still refuses to allow you onto the stage, quoting food, health, and safety laws. Officers explained to the pastor several times that he cannot refuse you service on the stage, but he is still refusing. This information was then relayed to you. At your request, officers submitted a case on the pastor for the service dog violation. No arrest was made due to jail restrictions, and no citation is able to be written for this offense. It is understandably frustrating to feel that officers did not fully enforce the law for you. Whether the prosecutor's office elects to prosecute is out of our hands, but our office can assure you that our officers did everything they could for you this day. The investigation did not reveal any violations of policy or law by the involved officer. The involved officers have been exonerated. Exonerated means that the acts or allegations did occur, but were justified and proper. Allegation number 2. For the incident at the Gospel Mission, again, our officers were not aware of the service dog law, and you again provided them with the law on your phone and also educated them on this, and we appreciate you for doing so. Officers attempted to educate the Gospel Mission staff on the service dog law and told them that they cannot refuse you due to your dog. The Gospel Mission has a policy in place that covers service dog laws that our officers also referred to during this incident. The questions asked by our officer were in line with the Gospel Mission policy and the service dog law. As with the Bronson Park incident, our officers wrote the case as you requested and submitted it for review. The investigation did not reveal any violations of policy or law by the involved officer. The involved officers have been exonerated. Exonerated means that the acts or allegations did occur, but were justified and proper. Allegation number 3. While you were at Fairmont Dog Park, a caller made a complaint that there were dogs not on leashes. Public Safety Officer Pena responded and witnessed your dogs off leash and not in the fenced-in dog run area. During this time, one of your dogs began to chase someone in the park and bark at them. Voluntary compliance with the law is often the officer's goal. As was with this incident, PSO Pena pleaded with you to put your dogs on a leash, as did the other people with you, but you refused and demanded 2 citations. PSO Pena then issued you a citation at that time for ordinance violation. The investigation did not reveal a violation of policy by the involved officer. Your complaint was found to be unfounded. Unfounded means the alleged acts did not occur or did not involve department members. Allegation number 4. Inspector Giles investigated your complaint into Sergeant Hubble's contact with you and his investigation. You allege that Sergeant Hubble lied to you when he spoke to you about the Fairmont Dog Park incident. At the time of your contact with Sergeant Hubble, he was not aware that you had also called dispatch to report a loose dog, as there were no names attached to the dispatch. You stated you called after officers had left the area to report a loose dog. So Sergeant Hubble believed that dispatch had created a second call for service, but it was later found that they did not, and that they added your complaint into the original call. Sergeant Hubble found this information out after he had spoken to you. Due to you making formal complaint on him, it was not appropriate for him to speak with you any further at that time. Anytime information is told to you that does not align with what was done can be frustrating. With the incident, there was no intent to provide you with false information. There was only a miscommunication in interpreting the dispatch information. The investigation did not reveal any violations of policy or law by the involved officer. The involved officer has been exonerated. Exonerated means that the acts or allegations did occur, but were justified and proper. Sergeant Hubble was handling your various complaints in accordance with Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety policy. Once the investigation was complete, it was forwarded to the Chief of Public Safety for final review. It was noted that Sergeant Hubble did inadvertently provide incorrect information to you during a phone conversation. However, it was based on the information he had available to him at that time. This was not intentionally or maliciously done. Before he was able to remedy the oversight, you filed an additional formal complaint against him. The information was corrected, relayed in the final report to the chief. The Office of Professional Standards recommended that the allegation be closed as exonerated. Exonerated means that the acts or allegations did occur, but were justified and proper. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dusick. Mr. Stanley has requested, and his request has been honored, that this hearing be open to the public, and it is open to the public. I will go through the process that we follow in these appeal hearings for those who are participating. Question to the board. Is there any member of the board who is unable to render an unbiased opinion on this appeal due to a relational, financial, or other conflict of interest? If so, we need to know that now. Hearing no response. We will hear from the appellant and why Mr. Stanley disagrees with the chief's determination of the complaint. That will be first. After hearing from Mr. Stanley, we will hear from the investigators to describe the investigation that was undertaken to inform the chief's finding. Mr. Stanley has requested that the hearing is open to the public. And while the hearing is open to the public, we request, and there's not going to be an opportunity for any public outbursts because we are on Zoom. While there will not be an opportunity for public comments during this particular hearing, all regular citizens public safety review and appeal board meetings are open to the public and offer an opportunity for public comment on any topic. After hearing from Mr. Stanley and the investigator, the board will adjourn and go into closed session. At the conclusion of the board's deliberations and within 15 days of the close of the hearing, the board will prepare a written report to be submitted to the city manager with a recommendation to sustain or amend the chief's findings. The city manager shall have final authority to sustain or amend the chief's findings and will notify the appellant of his determination within 20 business days following the appeal hearing. The next statements are of key importance. There will be no questioning by Mr. Stanley of the investigators who will be presenting, and the investigators. There will be no questioning of Mr. Stanley by you. Is there any comment or does everyone understand that requirement? Hearing no comment, I'll move on. This presentation by Mr. Stanley and by KDPS is to focus on the incidents that were described earlier by Ms. Dusick and limit it to that scope. And so we want to make sure that KDPS and Mr. Stanley remain focused on what we're here to discuss and review. Any questions or comments on that? Hearing none. Mr. Stanley, a couple of things. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise on how we should be interacting with support animals in our community. You've obviously got some expertise in that area, and we appreciate you sharing that with our officers. With that said, and I appreciate that. With that said, please go ahead and present your complaint.
Shelly, I love what you've done with your hair. It looks great. So I'm not sure how much time I have. I can try to be super brief, or I can try to be super thorough, or somewhere in between. Do you have a preference?
I may be able to help with that a little bit. All the board members have a complete copy of all of your statements, and we have those in advance. So we've reviewed those thoroughly, I can assure you. And so we'll leave it to you. As long as the comments are focused on the complaint issues, then it's your choice on how to proceed, Mr. Stanley. Does that help at all?
I can try. We'll see how it goes here. So I guess we'll start with part of the reason I appealed the decision is because they said that there was no violation of policy. And although I agree that the punishment should not be severe for a lot of the violations that happened, I do not agree that there was no violation of policy. The officers put in their own reports that, for example, one of the sergeants said that he asked my dog for her vaccination records. KDPS service dog policies state that no individual should speak to a service dog. It's pretty blatant. There's a violation of policy. He put it in his own report. It's not the end of the world, but I do think that when someone files a formal complaint and there is a violation of policy, it should be a learning experience, not how can we cover this up so that we don't have to pay any consequences. It should be more of a weighing of how severe should the consequence be? Should it be like, hey, read over the policy so you know it? It's not super severe, and I think that's beneficial for everybody involved, especially since every single officer I've ever interacted with says, I'm not familiar with those rules. I guess I'll start sharing my screen here. And we will, I guess I'll just look at the service dog one with you guys real quick here. The work or task performed by a service animal must be directly related to the individual's disability. Sometimes when people read this, they think that that means I need to know what your disability is to make sure that I know that the service animal's task is directly related to your disability. But that is inappropriate. Member responsibilities: service animals that are assisting individuals with disabilities are permitted in all public facilities in areas where the general public is allowed. I would underline and capitalize the word all. Department members are expected to treat individuals with service animals with the same courtesy and respect the Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety affords to all members of the public. So in one of my interactions, Officer, let's see here. Gilmore informed me that he did not see any tags on my service animal and that is something that somebody could be cited for. Although technically he's true. It's both a city ordinance, it's a county ordinance. County doesn't have very many ordinances. And it's a state law that your dog has to have tags on it at all times. But the city commission in 1997 said that the only time anybody would ever be cited with a violation of that is when somebody complained. And the reason I find a concern with Mr. Gilmore bringing that up is because the Kalamazoo Gospel Mission never complained about my dogs not having tags. They simply gave him a copy of their policies, which says that dogs have to have tags on them. Nobody brought it up. Nobody cared that my dog had a tag on it or not. So he went over and beyond saying, like, what else could I find him in trouble for? And then when I brought up that I was concerned that he brought that up, he said, well, I'm not going to arrest you for it. But I think we all understand that when an officer brings up, hey, I could arrest you for that, it's putting pressure on somebody to change some part of their behavior. You don't tell somebody, hey, I could do something to harm you in your life and expect them not to contemplate what type of change you want them to see. All right. So let me go back here. So everywhere else in the ADA and the state law and everything else, this word right here is may, but in Kalamazoo police policy, it says should. And I think that might be confusing because every single officer I have asks me, is that a service animal required because of a disability? And what task or service has that animal been trained to perform? And I think they don't study these policies as much as like I've studied it preparing for this meeting. And they might be confusing the word should with shall. So they think that there's a responsibility there. I don't know what's in their mind, but I know in every other document, this word is may, not should. If the individual explains that the animal is required because of a disability and has been trained to work or perform at least one task, the animal meets the definition of service animal, and no further questions as to the animal status should be asked. The individual should not be questioned about his or her disability, nor should the person be asked to provide any license, certification, or identification card for the service animal. And I have a problem with this word should, because up here, the word should means it would be a good idea. It's a recommendation. But under state law, if you ask for a license or a certification or identification card, that's a criminal misdemeanor. So, I don't know. Anyways, that's my opinions there. Service animals are not pets. Department members should not interfere with the important work performed by a service animal by talking to, petting, or otherwise initiating contact with a service animal. And this is probably the biggest part right here. I think this green portion right here is super confusing, the way that it's written. Absent a violation of law, independent of the ADA. So you'll read in all the reports, I don't know how many of you have read the police reports or just my 8-page complaint. But all the officers indicated to me that they were not allowed to do anything. And they referred me to the Department of Justice. I believe that they were trying to follow their policy. Absent a violation of law, independent of the ADA, public safety officers should take no enforcement action beyond keeping the peace. Individuals who believe they have been discriminated against as a result of a disability should be referred to the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. And that's what they're all doing. The problem is that this says absent a violation of law. The Michigan compiled law 750-502C states that if you do any of these 1, 3, or 6 through 9 is a violation of law, it's a misdemeanor. You're not supposed to do 1 through 9, but 1, 3, and 6 through 9 are misdemeanors. So if somebody's violating the ADA, your officers are not supposed to take any action according to this policy. I don't think this policy is illegal, but I do think it's very confusing. And I think it's the city's way of saying, we don't have any responsibility. We didn't violate your rights. The policy does not violate your rights. The officer did. However, the policy is written in a way that every single officer that I've interacted with, which is dozens, have been following what they believe it says, but they've not been following the law. And they have been violating my civil rights, which I believe compromises their immunity. I advise Stanley that the gospel mission is private property and can refuse him service. So let's go back here. Move this. Trespassing. A violator must not have a right to the property. The number of times I've interacted with an officer who has had somebody say, we don't want that dog here. And I'm like, well, it's a service dog. And they go, okay, I'm clever. We're going to no trespass you, not the dog. We're not saying the dog can't stay. We're saying you can't stay. Well, why can't I stay? Because of the dog. It's on the police cameras. I didn't see it in the report, but it's on the police cameras, which I was not allowed to review. Violators must not have a right to the property. I was told I was not allowed on the stage in Bronson Park. I believe I have just as much of a right as everybody else to walk up those steps and grab a bottle of water. I believe I have a right to the property. I believe people, as the mayor said last night in the city commission meeting, the Kalamazoo Gospel Mission is a place for anybody who's willing to spend the night. That's what the mayor said. I think people that are homeless are encouraged by the government to stay at the Kalamazoo Gospel Mission. But the Kalamazoo Gospel Mission has a policy that says you have to have a recent flea treatment bath by a veterinarian before you can stay the night there. I think that's insane. I don't know how many of you carry identification cards for your pets saying that they've had a recent flea bath from a vet. I personally don't know anybody who gets their flea treatment from a vet. Everybody I know buys it online or from PetSmart or something like that. It's way cheaper. So go back here. Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety Policy 310. Supervisors shall not knowingly issue orders or directives that, if carried out, would result in a violation of any law or department policy. No member is required to obey any order that appears to be in direct conflict with any federal law, state law, or local ordinance. When I was at the mission, the officers tried very hard to persuade me to leave. The mission staff wanted me to leave. They said they were no trespassing me. You are trespassed. You cannot be here. We're private property. You can't be here. Private property that serves the public has a responsibility to serve anybody that has a service animal, as long as it's under control and housebroken. And they didn't want to. And so the officer said, well, we could arrest you for trespassing. I think that's inappropriate. I don't think you can arrest somebody because they use a service animal. When someone says, I'm no trespassing you because you have a dog, that's a violation of civil rights. No member is required to obey any order that appears to be in direct conflict with any federal, state, or local ordinance. I think that's a problem. I think that's a violation of policy. Supervisors and managers are required to follow all policies and procedures and may be subject to discipline for or failure to be reasonably aware of the performance of their subordinates or provide appropriate guidance and control. Failure to promptly and fully report any known misconduct of a member to his or her immediate supervisor or to document such misconduct appropriately or as required by police. Directing a subordinate to violate policy or directive, acquiescing to such a violation or exhibiting indifference to such a violation, exercising unequal or disparate authority toward any member for malicious or other improper purposes. So I think if your officers are saying, hey, they don't want you here, we will arrest you for trespass. We don't want to. We don't want to take you to jail. We don't want to separate you from your service animal. We would take her to the pound and we take you to jail. We don't want to do that. That puts a feeling inside of me of conflict. Should I obey the laws or should I give in to their intimidation tactics? I recognize that police can use pressure to get people to change their behaviors. And that's what I was asking them to do to the pastor. When I spoke to the officer at the mission, not at the mission, at Bronson Park, I said,
I'm just trying to figure out at what point do the police help educate individuals on what the laws are and enforce them, I guess. Yeah, we can help educate people. Okay.
So I said, at what point do officers educate people and enforce the law? I did say enforce a little bit quieter because my goal is not, I'm not trying to get the guy arrested. I'm trying to be able to use the services just like everybody else. But as Shelley said, as the report said, as the officer said, everybody said, you asked us not to take any action. You asked us only to educate him. That's not accurate. That's partially the truth. Here are two attorneys from the Department of Justice and Civil Rights talking a little bit about this.
Guideline, which will come up a little bit later when we talk about some of the cases that we get. A service animal can't be excluded simply because the healthcare staff feel that they are able to perform the functions of the service animal or because they don't see the need for the service animal. And typically you may see staff saying that they either can push the wheelchair around and take the person to the locations that they need to go, or they can treat any of the items that the service animal may be able to do. Again, irrespective of what that function is, that is not a sufficient basis for ever excluding a service animal from an area. And again, care for a service animal, this is in the ADA, so we talked about earlier, it's in the CDC guidelines as well. The care for the service animal and the control of the service animal is the responsibility of the patient throughout the stay, although the patient can turn to her family and friends to help meet that responsibility. So now, we actually want to spend some time talking about the issues and the cases that we have seen in our past few years in the enforcement of our agencies. I'm just going to start out by saying that we actually do see a fair amount of cases involving service animals in HHS. I did look through maybe 35 or 40 of them as we were working to develop our presentation. I didn't actually see any involving animals other than dogs, surprisingly, but I know this does come up often from the Justice Department. But I do want to add, in nearly all of these cases, we did identify compliance concerns, either with how a particular person was treated or with the service animal policy that an entity had in place. So it's important to understand what your rights are, because there will frequently be circumstances where you may be facing a policy or certain actions that may not always be consistent with the law.
So I've tried really hard to figure out what the laws are. I've tried really hard to figure out what I'm supposed to do in these encounters. And repeatedly people say, oh, she doesn't have a vest on. Well, the law specifically says she doesn't have to have a vest on. They say, well, where's your ID card? The deputy city attorney, Richard Cherry, and the deputy city manager at the time tried to have me arrested for walking in City Hall with a service dog because I didn't have an ID. You can't do that. All right, I'm jumping around a little bit. Sorry about that. So let's talk about the dog park a little bit. This is the state law. Dog licensing tags, leashes shall be unlawful for any person. Talks a lot about the dog tag. And then at the bottom it says, or for any owner to allow any dog except for working dogs, such as leader dogs, guard dogs, farm dogs, hunting dogs, and other such dogs, when accompanied by their owner or his authorized agent, will actively engage in activities for which dogs are trained to stray unless held properly in a leash. I think what that means is your dog is allowed to stray. It's allowed to not be well trained if it's on a leash. If your dog does not stray and stays right next to you and it does a task that it's trained to do, it does not have to be on a leash. This is the city code. It shall be unlawful for the owner of any dog to permit such a dog to be off the premises of the owner, including but not limited to private roads open to the general public and the common areas of multiple dwellings and trailer parks, unless the dog is held securely on a leash. And then I'll bring this up real quick. In 1997, some city commissioners expressed the revised ordinance. The revised ordinance dealt with an inconsistency with the definitional provisions of animals running at large. And there were a number of situations when owners had their dogs under control, even though the dog was not actually on a leash. Those concerns were addressed at 719B. The changes made it unlawful for any owner of a dog to permit the dog to be off the owner's premises unless the dog was held securely on a leash. However, the requirement would not apply to working dogs and animals. It would not apply to dogs under the immediate control of the owner. A presumption was added that if a dog bit or attacked somebody, it would be presumed that the dog was not under control of the owner. If the city ran into enforcement issues, the city would address. So 719B says this section shall not apply to working dogs, such as leader dogs, guard dogs, farm dogs, hunting dogs, and other dogs, which is not defined at all. When accompanied by their owner, so they can't just be loose on their own, or authorized agent, when actively engaged in lawful activities, so you can't be taking drugs across the border or something, for which such dogs are trained. This section shall not apply to dogs which are under the immediate control of the owner, and provided the owner is in the immediate proximity to the dog. Should a dog, while not on a leash, chase, and I pulled up the definition of chase because we can't all agree on that for some reason. So according to the dictionary, chase means go after with the intent to catch. The policeman chased the mugger down the alley. The dog chased the rabbit. It also means the act of pursuing in the effort to overtake or capture. Should a dog, while not on a leash, chase, bite another human or animal, attack, chase, or bite another human or animal, it shall be presumed that the dog is not under the immediate control of the owner, and that, therefore, this is a violation of this section. So I don't think that playing fetch falls under illegal, and I don't think that playing fetch is attacking, chasing, or biting. If I go to the officer's report, Officer Pena. So I had an experience with Officer Pena a couple of years ago in Bronson Park, where I filed a formal complaint, but for some reason it's disappeared.
Mr. Stanley,
Yep.
would you please stick to the complaint at hand, not 2 years ago?
I think it's really important.
Also, the information that you're providing is redundant to the information that we already have. And the research and history associated with that is something that I don't think is germane to this discussion that we're having. When you go back and cite civil rights laws that aren't directly connected to and relevant to this discussion. And I say that only because in the interest of staying focused on what we're trying to deal with here. Thank you so much.
So Officer Pena informed me that there was a law that dogs had to be on a leash.
Hello, folks. You guys call? Or somebody else call? There's a lady that's called before because we were barbecuing. Yeah. We know we have leash laws. She called about that. Okay. Dogs can be in the park without leashes, can't be outside the park without leashes. 6 foot? All right. Would you mind writing me a citation for that? No.
No, don't do that.
So clearly, there is no exception. The dogs have to be on a leash. But clearly, the city, the county, and the state all disagree with that. So if we go back to his report, he fills out his information, he fills out my information. There's a copy of the ticket, and it appears that this is the report. Put my phone number. On September 2nd at approximately 17:30 hours, KDPS Pena was dispatched to Fairmount Dog Park for a report of an animal complaint regarding loose dogs running outside of the designated area. Upon arrival, I made contact with numerous citizens in the area and found several leash violations. I requested the owners to leash their dogs outside of the fenced-in area. All complied except for Stanley. He was given the verbal warning and complained and refused to leash his dogs, white and black poodles. Stanley requested that he be cited for the issue, which he wished to do to promote equal treatment. Stanley confirmed the 2 dogs without leashes were his. His identity was verified, and Stanley was issued a misdemeanor citation and advised on how to follow up with the courts. The only thing that the officer put in his report was about a leash. The dog did not have a leash. Officer Hubble, when I spoke to him the next day, said, "But your dog chased somebody." And this is what he's referring to.
No. You want to cause more drama? I'm on the Parks and Rec board. So I've asked the director if we can do anything about that rule. He said, no officer's ever going to give you a problem. I'm not going to do it because I don't feel like there's a need to. These dogs appear to be well behaved. Yep. She's saying that she's going to put a leash on the dog. Yep. Simple as that. So are these yours? Yes. Behaved, but they still need leashes. So right. Are you refusing? I'm not going to get into it. Mr. Stanley. Yes. I'm not going to get into it. Okay. Simple as that. Yep. Do you not want to put a leash on a dog? I want the rules changed. Well then, I think make it happen when you get elected. Right? I'm already on the parks board. The park should be able to address it. Hey, come here. It's a come on. It's a city ordinance issue. Is it a parks issue or is it a city ordinance issue? I'm talking about just for the parks. I think if the dogs are in this part of the dog park, that should be fine. It's a liability issue.
So that was my dog chasing somebody. That is a vicious and dangerous animal, not under control. I told her to come to me, and she did. He doesn't address that in his report at all. The officer never included any of that in his report. His superior, after I filed a complaint against him for his behavior, changed the report. Somebody who works directly for the chief said, "Oh, your dog chased somebody." That has connotations that most people would think was dangerous. This dog was not dangerous. She was walking up to one of my friends that was walking away to put something in his car. I called her, she came back. Officer Hubble said, "But she walked away." That means that she wasn't under control, which implies if she does anything, she's not under control. That doesn't make any sense. If my dog rolls over and I say sit and she sits, according to his logic, she's not under control. He also says that I asked for a supervisor. I don't know how much of this you want to listen to.
Area. They're contained.
But I never asked for a
supervisor. People that go in there
supervisor.
have to agree to that liability. I'm not going to argue with you about it. I'm saying put the dogs on a leash. Okay. Do you want to talk to somebody else about it? You're more than welcome to. There you go. Say
You guys won't show up.
I'll bet you $1,000. When I call the mayor, if I say David Anderson's playing fetch with his dog at Woodward Elementary School, I've already done it twice. Nobody shows up. The laws apply to me, but not to people that have power and wealth in this town. The laws apply to you, and you're not getting a citation.
I know he just wants to pick a fight.
Well, not
Can you
really.
put a leash?
He wants to pick a fight.
I'm not trying to pick a
You
fight.
want to pick a fight with the mayor, which is,
No,
you
I
can
don't
do
wanna
what you
pick a fight
want.
with the mayor.
Are you gonna put a leash on him?
No, I'm not.
There you go.
Do we need to write a citation for dogs? All right, if we're gonna go that route, I can call a supervisor and we'll go that route. All right,
I've
All right.
asked to bring it up at the.
I'll call for him.
I never asked for a supervisor.
Can you respond up to the Fairmount Dog Park?
I think it goes to show that Officer Pena has,
No, I'm out with Mr. Stanley. See,
I don't know how to say
supervisor.
it, some imagination.
Hire.
Before he even started writing the citation, my dogs were on a leash.
Yeah, he's fighting with us.
I'm here, so this one is 10 minutes out. Do you want them to start? They are en route, 10 minute ETA, I'll cancel life.
I don't know if I can say this on double speed.
Happy to respond and come out.
Just go ahead and go down.
If the fight just down the hill, and he's more than happy to respond and come out.
Just go ahead and go down.
If he's okay with me leaving, I'm fine with still giving him the warning. That's what I said. So if you want me to go talk to him again, I will. I'm not gonna upset,
At this
people
point,
just because they want fair and equal treatment and they feel like they're not getting it. That's not an issue for the police. You know what I mean?
I mean, that is an issue for the police.
No, it's not.
How is that?
If he feels like he's above the law or below the law or somebody else is, then maybe somebody else should remove him from office or elect somebody else, right?
I feel that the police officer.
All right, well, I will continue to write the citation and wait for the officer to come.
I don't think that that's in the best interest.
And I don't think that is either.
So they're on a leash. I'm trying to be really civil here.
Yep, that's fine, and I was too.
Okay,
So I'm waiting for my supervisor to come like he asked for.
we're good.
No, you're not. Okay, you want to wait over by is it your husband or I don't know who he is to you?
I just
Okay,
patron of the doctor.
okay.
31, he just left the Mazo.
so I mean, you can hear Officer Pena say that he doesn't think it's in the best interest either. You can hear everybody in the dog park saying like, get out of here. There's a car racing down the street going like 90 miles an hour. And there's a bunch of people there like, go get a real criminal. I don't think that this is bringing positive attention to the police department. I mean, I feel like I've been talking forever here. I could go into standards of conduct, trespassing, temporary custody, handcuffing, use of force.
Mr. Stanley,
Yep.
I can inform you up to this point, your presentation has been very, very informative. And if it's going to be more confirmation of what you've already presented, then I would say that you've really given us ample information.
So
If there's something else that is important to you that the board here, by all means, I encourage you to present that.
I'll try and wrap up here pretty quick.
Thank you.
Report should be sufficiently detailed for the purposes and free from errors prior to submission of approval. All reports shall accurately reflect the identity of the persons involved. All pertinent information seen, heard, and assimilated by any other sense, and any action taken. Members shall not suppress, conceal, distort the facts of any reported incident, nor shall any member make a false report orally or in writing. Generally, the reporting member's opinion shall not be included in reports unless specifically identified as such. Appropriate grammar. When a member responds with offer service. Anyways, so I mean, there's a bunch of policies that I found that were violated. Use of force 1, use of force 2, use of force 3, use of force, temporary custody of an adult, adult abuse, body worn cameras. I mean, but
And these are all germane to your complaints.
What does germane mean?
All relevant and
Yeah.
informative, additive to the complaint that you filed against the department.
Yeah, and I don't think that this should come up at the appeal. I think that these things should come up during the complaint. But the chief's office, the Office of Internal Review, found no violations. I don't understand how that's possible. Everybody's exonerated because either they didn't know they were doing something wrong, which feels like a Dave Chappelle skit. Oh, sorry, officer, I didn't know I was violating the law. It's absurd.
Thank you for that, but we're focused on the appeal, and that's our responsibility, and that's what we have to do that for the community, Mr. Stanley. So, is there anything else additive that you would like to share? Or we can
I guess I'll just inform you guys of a couple more clips here about vaccination requests. These are pretty quick.
Another issue that we also see quite often, healthcare providers may not require certification or documentation or tags or jackets. No documentation or certification of any sort can be required. We've had one facility that required someone to have a certificate that there was a medical need for the service animal, which is inappropriate for a host of reasons, but in any event, just want to be clear that certification can never be required.
Mr. Stanley, may I interrupt you, sir?
No, and I think this also goes back to.
Yeah, of course.
Are these presentations that you're giving us settled law?
So these two women,
The lawyers, is that settled law? Or are they arguing the case? That's a question to you, sir.
this is a presentation. It's specifically for access to hospitals, but it applies.
So that's not settled law, is that correct?
I feel like your question is,
Well, what I'm saying is that if it's settled law, it's very
Yes.
important to hear that.
it is
But if
settled
it's-
law. These
Thank
are
you,
all
sir.
cases that the Deputy Chief of Disability Rights for the United States Department of Justice has settled. She's an attorney for the Federal Department of Justice. She has settled these cases.
Thank you, sir.
And the other woman is a civil rights analyst for the Civil Rights United States Department of Health and Human Services.
And this is, you've shown this to us before. This is additive information, I take it.
So I guess I'm not sure if I have to interact with every officer. Because another thing that happens is officers say, well, I've never interacted with you before, therefore their behavior is acceptable. I don't think that's appropriate. I think you should learn lessons as you go through life, not be able to get away with whatever you want. Here's one about vaccinations, which directly relate. I won't play the whole thing, but
There is another very big issue that we see in most service animal policies probably, but the principle is when you've taken the position that healthcare providers may not require a veterinarian certificate of health or any other health records. Let me just give you some examples of types of requirements that we've seen. We had one covered entity required that the certificate be maintained on file in the hospital for the year. Yet another that required an annual physical exam from somebody. Yet another entity that.
yeah, that's enough. I mean, you can't require that stuff. And here's one last one.
Separation, another important issue. As a general rule, the person with the disability should not be separated from their service animal, and the person with the disability and their service animal should not be separated from other individuals receiving comparable services in comparable circumstances. We did have a case involving what was essentially a business meeting between the person with the disability and their service animal, and the person who was on the staff was afraid of dogs, and so wanted the animal omitted completely from the meeting area. The person with disability appropriately said no, and as a compromise, they agreed to meet in a very large room with the individual and her service animal at one end and the staff person at the other end. And we did also find concerns about that. There are alternatives. They could have had a different staff person meet with the individual. They could have ensured that the animal was sufficiently under control to assuage any concerns that the staff person may have had, but fear of animals is generally not going to be a permissible reason for that. So the handler for any other number of reasons. You know, this is a relationship between a human being and an animal on which he or she relies to function independently. And the longer apart, first of all, you know, the animal may have significant anxiety, and separation anxiety, and it can also deteriorate this relationship that has over the years really been worked to develop. It just doesn't end well in almost all circumstances when there's a separation.
So, I mean, I think you guys get my general drift with the service animal stuff. I guess I'll add, when I was at Bronson Park, as I was talking to the initial 2 officers before the supervisor got there, there was another young lady that she had no arms, and she was told she had to leave, and she quietly and politely turned around and left. And that's what happens to most people that are in that position. It's not worth the fight. I'm the opposite. I don't know how to stop sometimes. But the officers were not willing to take any action against the people, even like that pressure that I was talking about earlier. Oh, you don't have your tags on the dog. We could cite you for that. That's the pressure I'm talking about. They didn't put handcuffs on me. They didn't beat me with a baton. They didn't throw me in the back of the car. They didn't take me to jail. They didn't do anything extreme, but they used pressure to try to get me to leave. I think they could have used pressure to try and get the pastor to allow the young lady to get food from the park. I guess I would add that the pastor didn't have permission to be in the park. I don't think that was in the report at all.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Mr. Stanley. I appreciate the thoroughness and the work that you put in to your appeal. At this time, we'll hear from the Office of Professional Standards.
Is everybody able to see this shared screen I have up? Yes. Everybody can hear me too also, I hope.
Yes, we can
Okay,
see that.
perfect. Thank you. Just want to make sure, double check before you keep going. Thank you, Chairman Payne, Director Dusick, and the members of the board. My name is Sergeant Doug Hubble, and I'm currently assigned to the Office of Professional Standards, with this complaint being assigned to me. With me tonight is Assistant Chief Green and Inspector Giles. Tonight, I will go over with the board the allegations made by Mr. Stanley and my investigation into those allegations. This presentation will cover the allegations from 3 incidents that Mr. Stanley made with the Office of Professional Standards. My investigation included reviewing body-worn cameras, interviewing Mr. Stanley on several occasions, and reviewing written reports for each incident. I will go over each incident separately, cover the allegations made in each and what my investigation covered. Again, this is PCR complaint 2021-18. For this, Mr. Stanley filled out a complaint form and submitted it to KDPS headquarters on August 18th, 2021. His report alleged that he has made reports of unlawful discrimination for several years now. He alleged that officers refused to read the service animal law when he provided it to them, and that we threatened to trespass him if he refused to leave a location. Mr. Stanley also alleged that officers tried to intimidate him by asking about dog tags for his dog and telling him that it is a civil offense to not have the dog license. Upon speaking with Mr. Stanley over the phone, he alleged that officers were not familiar with the service animal law, officers did not want to learn the service animal law, and officers refused to enforce the service animal law. For this presentation, I've separated each of the 3 incidents and we'll cover those independently. For the first incident that Mr. Stanley made a complaint on, occurred on July 28, 2021 at 4:13 p.m. This occurred at Bronson Park, which is at 200 South Rose Street. This is the first incident of the 3 that I investigated. For this allegation, I interviewed Mr. Stanley and spoke with him several times after our initial interview at his request. I then reviewed the police reports that were submitted and also reviewed all the officers' body worn cameras. For the second incident that occurred, this also was on July 28, 2021, approximately 5 hours later at 8:56 p.m. And this occurred at the Kalamazoo Gospel Mission located at 448 North Burdick Street. For this allegation, my investigation included interviewing Mr. Stanley, reviewing the police reports that were submitted, and reviewing all the officers' body worn cameras. The third incident that I investigated occurred on September 2nd, 2021 at the Fairmont Dog Park. This was at 1108 North Prairie Street. For this allegation, I interviewed Mr. Stanley. I reviewed the police report and citation, and then reviewed the body camera footage from Officer Pena and also Sergeant Aarons. Next, I'd like to pick each individual complaint separately and talk about my investigation. The first one we'll begin with is the Bronson Park. For this incident, Mr. Stanley flags down PSO Lockett and explains to her that he is being denied food from the Bronson Park stage due to him having a service dog. Mr. Stanley explains that the service animal law, or explains the service animal law to PSO Lockett, who says she is not familiar with the law and not sure what to do about this. At the same time, PSO Ellis is driving by and Officer Lockett asks for her to stop to assist her. Mr. Stanley then tells PSO Ellis what had happened with the passer on the stage, and then shows her the service animal law on his phone while explaining it to her. PSO Ellis also acknowledged that she too is unfamiliar with the service animal law, as it is a law that our officers do not come across on a regular basis. Mr. Stanley requests PSO Ellis contact the pastor and educate him on the law. He tells her that he does not want him arrested and states it would be, quote, ridiculous for KDPS to arrest him. He also tells PSO Ellis that he knows the pastor excludes service dogs from the mission all the time. PSO Ellis agrees to speak with the pastor to see if a solution can be found. PSO Ellis then contacts the pastor on the stage, who explains that food service laws do not allow non-service dogs on the stage because the animal could have fleas and cannot have the animal around food. He also claims that the dog needs a vest to identify it as a service animal. PSO Ellis then questions the pastor what the difference would be between a dog with a vest and one that does not have a vest when we're talking about an animal having fleas. The pastor still insists that he cannot allow the dog on the stage, but offered to bring Mr. Stanley a plate of food. PSO Ellis tries, but is unable to get the pastor to allow Mr. Stanley on the stage. She then reports back to Mr. Stanley with what the pastor had said. Mr. Stanley then requests a supervisor, so PSO Ellis contacts Sergeant Bentley. Sergeant Bentley arrives and speaks with Mr. Stanley. Mr. Stanley explains the situation to him and asks that Sergeant Bentley educate the pastor on the service animal law. Sergeant Bentley then goes and contacts the pastor. The pastor says that Mr. Stanley needs a vest or identification for his dog, to which Sergeant Bentley explains the animal does not need anything that identifies it as a service dog, or for Mr. Stanley to show some sort of credentials for the animal. Sergeant Bentley explains the service animal food service laws. Sergeant Bentley continues to explain to the pastor that he is not correct and he cannot deny Mr. Stanley's service due to a service animal. The pastor is still misunderstood in the law and believes that he can ask for documentation, even though Sergeant Bentley has explained the law to him. The pastor agrees to review that service animal law over the weekend. Sergeant Bentley then advises the pastor the officer will be documenting this incident. He then recontacts Mr. Stanley and reports to him what the pastor said. He also explains the officer will document this incident and will send it in for review by the courts. Mr. Stanley is also requested to file a report with the Department of Justice per KDPS policy. Mr. Stanley then inquires what can be done due to the pastor violating the law. Sergeant Bentley again explains to him that the case will be submitted for review, that no citation can be issued for this charge, and that no arrest will be made. Mr. Stanley then asks Sergeant Bentley what will happen if he goes to the gospel mission night and tries to stay, and he, referring to the pastor, refuses him to allow to stay the night. Sergeant Bentley again advising the officer to respond and submit a case for the violation. Next, I'd like to look at the three allegations that Mr. Stanley had made in reference to the officers. Mr. Stanley alleged that officers did not know the service animal law and that they did not want to learn the law. He then alleged that officers refused to enforce the service animal law. Regarding allegation one, the officers were not familiar with the law. Mr. Stanley was correct with this statement. Although officers are aware of the service animal law, officers were not well versed in the service animal law in its entirety. Officers explained this to Mr. Stanley upon speaking with him. There are roughly 3,000 laws on file in Michigan, which makes it difficult for officers to know every law out there, especially ones officers do not see on a frequent basis, such as this one. KDPS recognizes that our officers are human. We make mistakes just like everyone else. We also recognize that we cannot expect our officers to be 100% correct all the time. Regarding allegation 2, the officers do not want to learn the law. Mr. Stanley shows the officers the service animal law on his cell phone, educating them on it, and explains to them the areas that the pastors violate. The officers took this education that he provided, spoke to the pastor, explained to him that he was in fact wrong. Allegation number 3, officers refuse to enforce the law. Officers educate the pastor on the service animal law, but he still refused to allow Mr. Stanley onto the stage to obtain food. Due to this, officers submitted a civil rights violation case to the prosecutor's office on August 6, 21. On August 9, 21, the case and charges were denied on the pastor. With this case, officers do not have the ability to issue a citation for this offense, as with many misdemeanor charges. Officers could make an arrest, but used discretion and did not. Officers may elect to make arrests for misdemeanor violation or choose to submit cases instead. This is first due to COVID restrictions and trying to limit our close contacts with people. If an arrest was to be made, then the person would have to ride in close quarters in our patrol car and be in close quarters within our facility, subjecting our officers to exposure to COVID for a non-violent crime. Secondly, officers use their discretion to not make an arrest, as the pastor was handing out free food to our citizens, and making an arrest would not be in anyone's best interest. Finally, Mr. Stanley told officers that he did not want the pastor arrested, only to be educated on the service animal law, which was done by officers. Next, I'd like to look at the gospel mission incident. Approximately 5 hours later, our night shift officers responded after the mission called to report that Mr. Stanley was refusing to leave the property. During this incident, Officer Walsh makes initial contact with Mr. Stanley and the mission employee who had contact with Mr. Stanley. The employee says that Mr. Stanley got, quote, an attitude with them when they were covering their policy on service animals, and due to that, he was not welcome for the night and would need to come back in the morning to speak with management. PSO Walsh then explains to Mr. Stanley that due to this, that there was not a lot the officer could do for the night, and as he is saying this, Mr. Stanley interrupts and suggests, quote, you could arrest me for trespassing. PSO Walsh tells Mr. Stanley that officers are not going to arrest him for trespassing. PSO Gilmore has also arrived and contacts the mission staff. He explains to them that Mr. Stanley only has to answer the 2 questions for the service animal, and it appears that he's already answered them for him. Staff states that Mr. Stanley would not provide them further clarification on what the functions the animal provided, as they did not understand what tactile functions were. Due to him not cooperating, they advised him he could not stay the night. The mission policy is then shown to PSO Gilmore at that time. With any incident where there's a dispute between 2 parties, officers become a mediator between the 2 parties, and in order to keep the peace and try to mitigate the situation. Due to this, PSO Gilmore takes a copy of the gospel mission policy, and it is shown to Mr. Stanley. PSO Gilmore then explains the policy to him and asks if his dog has dog tags, as that is a requirement of the mission policy and law. Mr. Stanley shows his current dog tags to PSO Gilmore at his request, but is frustrated that PSO Gilmore is asking questions since the mission did not ask that themselves. PSO Gilmore explains to Mr. Stanley that he's only asking him the questions in the rules and policy of the mission. Sergeant Perez is then called, as it is clear that the mission is not going to back down on their stance, and Mr. Stanley is not going to leave. Sergeant Perez arrives, speaks with Mr. Stanley, and then explains to staff that Mr. Stanley answered their questions that is required to and does not have to answer anything else. Staff explains that their policy requires flea and tick treatment prior to entry. Sergeant Perez confirms with Mr. Stanley that he does in fact have his dog tags for the animal and requests if the animal has any flea and tick treatment per their policy. Mr. Stanley says that he does not feel it's right that officers are asking that question. Sergeant Perez explains to Mr. Stanley that officers are trying to help him stay the night and are only asking about the mission policy questions. Both Mr. Stanley and Sergeant Perez agree that there is some clear confusion over the wording in the service animal law, or if someone can ask if the animal has a flea and tick treatment. Sergeant Perez then explains to the staff that officers will not be having Mr. Stanley leave the building, as he's answered the 2 questions that he's required to. He also advised them that the case would be submitted for the service law violation. Sergeant Perez explains to Mr. Stanley that the mission staff is agreeing to allow him into the building and to stay, but he will not be able to sleep in the general area. Mr. Stanley Advises Sergeant Perez that this is also a violation of the service animal law. Mr. Stanley is advised that officers are not preventing him from going into that common sleeping area with everybody else, nor are they forcing him to stay out of that area. Officers clear at that time, and the case for the service animal violation is submitted. For this incident, officers spent over an hour at the mission trying to mediate a solution that would temporarily satisfy both parties without turning Mr. Stanley away or affecting operations of the mission. Officers also used discretion in this case by choosing to submit the case for the service animal violation in lieu of an arrest, and by choosing not to submit charges against Mr. Stanley for trespass. Regarding the allegations that were made by Mr. Stanley, there were 4 of them for the gospel mission. I would like to address each allegation made by Mr. Stanley and what my investigation covered. Allegation 1, officers were not familiar with the law. As stated with the Bronson Park incident, Mr. Stanley was correct with this statement, as officers are not well versed in that service animal law. Allegation 2, officers did not want to learn the law. Mr. Stanley shows officers the service animal law on his cell phone and explained them to the areas the mission staff is violating. Officers took this education provided and spoke to the mission staff, explaining them that they could not deny Mr. Stanley the stay solely on the fact that they did not understand what the tactile functions meant. Allegation 3, officers refused to enforce the law. Officers again educated the mission staff on the service animal law, but they still refused to allow Mr. Stanley to stay original. Due to this, officers submitted a civil rights violation report to the city attorney's office on 8/6 of 21. On 8/9 of 21, that case and charges were denied on the staff, stating that Mr. Stanley can file a civil rights complaint with the Department of Justice. For allegation 4, officers threatened to arrest Mr. Stanley for trespassing. During this incident, Mr. Stanley is the first person to mention trespassing and tells officers that they can arrest him if he refuses to leave. Officers did, during this contact, tell Mr. Stanley that if he were to be banned from the mission, then he could be arrested or cited for trespassing. All involved officers told him that they did not want that to happen and would not be enforcing that with him. This was not to intimidate or harass him, only to explain to him what would happen if he were to be banned from the mission property. Recognizing that officers were not very familiar with this service animal law and seeing a training opportunity, Sergeant Bentley, on his following shift, sent out an email on 7/29/21, which again was the following day, advising all officers of the service animal law, the KDPS policy, and a link to the service animal law for review and additional training so that we can better be versed with it. Finally, I would like to discuss the Fairmont Dog Park incident that Mr. Stanley made some allegations on. For this incident, PSO Pena, who is assigned to the district that the dog park resides in, arrives after he is dispatched to the park after a refused caller reported that dogs were off leashes outside of the dog run area. The caller did not give any names of who was in the park with dogs off leashes. He arrives and Mr. Stanley's 2 dogs are not on leashes in the picnic area of the park. They are not in the fenced-in area of the dog park where dogs are allowed to be off leash. There are 2 other dogs and they're also not on a leash. The owners of these dogs appear to be with Mr. Stanley. Mr. Stanley is advised of the leash law by PSO Pena. Mr. Stanley responds that he does not agree with the law and that the Parks and Recs Board president said KDPS would never write him a ticket for it. Mr. Stanley refuses to place his dogs on a leash and tells PSO Pena to write him a citation. The female that is with Mr. Stanley, whose dogs are also off leashes, puts her dogs on leashes at that time and complies with the ordinance and PSO Pena's request. PSO Pena tells Mr. Stanley that he does not want to write him a citation and is only requesting that he comply with the ordinance. Mr. Stanley still refuses to comply and again asks for a citation. The female whose dogs were also off leash also tells Mr. Stanley that he does not want to get a citation and tells him to put his dogs on a leash. During their conversation, one of Mr. Stanley's dogs does begin to trot away from Mr. Stanley towards a parking lot and barks at someone walking in that parking lot. Mr. Stanley hears his dog bark and calls out to it and it returns to him. Due to Mr. Stanley refusing to comply and demanding a citation, PSO Pena issues Mr. Stanley a citation. Mr. Stanley then demands a second citation, saying that both dogs were off leash. PSO Pena advises Mr. Stanley he is not going to issue 2 citations and that he did not want to issue the first one, but Mr. Stanley refused to comply. During the issuance of the citation, someone from Mr. Stanley's group that he is with puts his 2 dogs on a leash. Since PSO Pena had already witnessed the violation in his presence, he continued with the issuance of the citation. Sergeant Ayers then responds as a supervisor as PSO Pena could see that Mr. Stanley was not satisfied with his contact with him. Mr. Stanley again requests 2 citations, stating that he had 2 dogs off leash. Sergeant Aaron's advised Mr. Stanley that he will not issue a second citation and his dogs appear to be on leashes currently. Mr. Stanley tells Sergeant Ayers that he is refusing to put his dogs on a leash, that the leashes are not his, and he did not put the dogs on, or did not put the leashes on his dogs. Sergeant Ayers tells Mr. Stanley that he did not witness his dogs off the leash and will not issue a citation. Mr. Stanley begins to walk away and states that he's going to go take his dogs off a leash. Mr. Stanley then walks back to his patrol car and leaves the area and in his contact with Mr. Stanley. I know we've already seen some of these ordinances already tonight. A couple of ordinances that we looked at for this investigation was the 3324 leashing of dogs. It says all dogs, if you could pay a look to the yellow section for me. All dogs must be securely held and controlled on a leash no longer than 6 feet in length, except in such areas as the city may post and identify by appropriate signs as permitting dogs to be at large. Then subsection 2, this subsection should not apply to city parks that are designated as dog parks. Dog owners must, however, abide by the specific rules posted in those dog parks. For the Fairmont Dog Park, these are the rules that are posted, or a portion of the rules that are posted. I know it's kind of small, but number 4 down here, I don't know if you guys can see that. I'm going to go to the next slide to zoom in for you. It says dogs must remain leashed until they're inside the small or large run areas. The second ordinance that the city has regarding dogs and leashes are 719. The dogs are running at large. It should be unlawful for the owner of any dog to permit such dog. For the owner of any dog to permit such dog to be off the premises of such owner, including but not limited to private roads open to the general public, the common areas of multiple dwellings, and trailer parks, unless the dog is held securely on a leash. On the bottom, where the yellow is at, it said, should a dog while not on a leash attack, chase, or bite another human or animal, it shall be presumed that the dog is not under the immediate control of the owner, and that therefore there is a violation of this section. During this incident, Mr. Stanley's dog does trot away from him, barks, and appears to be chasing towards someone in the parking lot who is walking. Mr. Stanley is able to call his dog back when he sees this. Mr. Stanley does not tell PSO Pena that he believes he's exempt due to Section B, and therefore issues a citation for the 719. Probable cause existed at that time for the leash law violation, and PSO Pena issued the citation at that time. The allegation made by Mr. Stanley was that a citation was issued with no law being broken. Again, during this incident, Mr. Stanley had 2 dogs off leash, which is in violation of City Ordinance 719 and 3324, as they were previously shown. PSO Pena asked Mr. Stanley to put his dogs on leashes multiple times, but he refused. Mr. Stanley demanded a citation as soon as PSO Pena explained that dogs need to be on leashes. PSO Pena offered Mr. Stanley multiple opportunities to put his dogs on leashes, but Mr. Stanley still refused. Mr. Stanley was in violation of the city ordinance for leashing of dogs, and PSO Pena issued a citation correctly for that violation. This next slide shows a summary of the findings that we had for all 3 incidents. The Office of Professional Standards conducted a fair and impartial investigation into this complaint. This complaint was investigated by gleaning information from written reports, camera footage, and speaking with Mr. Stanley. After completion of this investigation, the Office of Professional Standards gave the recommendation of exonerated for Bronson Park and the Gospel Mission. Exonerated is when the investigation disclosed that the alleged act occurred, but the act was justified, lawful, or proper. That was for the mission and the Bronson Park. For the Fairmont Dog Park, a recommendation of unfounded was given. Unfounded is when the investigation discloses that the alleged acts did not occur or did not involve park members. Complaints that are determined to be frivolous will fall within the classification of unfounded. The recommendation was supported by the Chief of Public Safety, and the complaint was closed on 9/22/21. At this point, that concludes my presentation of my investigation into this complaint.
Thank you, Officer Hubble. Appreciate your additional information on this issue, this complaint. At this time, we will close the open complaint session and reconvene in a closed session to deliberate the complaint. I would request that, just a second, Mr. Stanley, I'll get right to you, sir. I would request that Ms. Vargas resend the closed session link via email and a text to the board so that we will all have that same information. Mr. Stanley, sir, you wanted to make a comment?
Yeah, the rules, the park rules that the officer shared are not the rules that were.
Mr. Stanley, we're not going to get in the back and forth about those types of issues, because we would then have to allow time for the officers to come back at you with questions about your presentation. And I'm not going to allow them to do that. So I'm not going to allow you to question their presentation. Is that okay, sir?
It's what he shared is not what the rules were at the time, and I don't think that's fair.
Okay, well, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Any other comments or discussion by the board before we go into closed session? Hearing none, I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you so much for your participation.